Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Mr. President, for bringing this resolution forward. I have a similar story to many of you all. Many of you all have family members that have been in the ROTC, but I want to bring this whole story around full circle and celebrate the victories that the United States has had and the sacrifice that they have made in Vietnam. My father, like Senator Schaefer, went ROTC and during the Vietnam era, went to Vietnam as a fighter pilot. He flew 178 missions in Vietnam and was truly a hero of mine and a hero of our families. He grew up on a small farm in Texas where his dad was born in a hole in the ground, literally a dugout in the ground. And you see what one generation what can be accomplished in a country in one generation. From where my grandfather was born in a dugout in the ground to where my father was flying supersonic jets and was one of the first 10 people to fly twice the speed of sound. What amazing things can happen in a nation with freedom. My father went to Vietnam and flew 178 missions in Vietnam and came back without one scratch, not one scratch. 2 years later, died at the age of 38 of a heart attack. Who would have ever guessed that that would happen to a guy that could fly 178 missions and come back without a scratch? I also want to remember the families that were left at home during that time. My mother was a rock. Senator Newell. My mother was a rock. But then when he passed away, she had 3 kids under the age of 12. Senator Newell. She raised 3 kids by herself. She never remarried. She had married her love of her life, her hero. She was never going to remarry again. 3 kids went to college. 2 of us have master's degrees. Move forward. I went to CSU, went ROTC, and right before I had to sign the dotted line, I got an offer to work in the White House of President Ronald Reagan. It's one of those forks in the road. Which way do you go? Sign the dotted line, go to boot camp, go work in the White House. I went and worked in the Reagan White House. And what an incredible opportunity that was, to be on the front lines of the fight for freedom that was going on in the Cold War. It was Ronald Reagan that stood up and said, "Mr. President, tear down this wall." He fought to bring down the Soviet Empire. We did not fight the Vietnam War for oil. We fought the Vietnam War to stop the spread of communism around the world, the domino effect. Ronald Reagan stood up and said, "Mr. President, tear down this wall." 2 years later, after President Reagan left office, that wall came down. And the sound of freedom rang across the world. 1 billion people were freed behind the Iron Curtain. Satellite communist countries like Vietnam started to collapse across the world. Communist Vietnam is still in place, but it is not the communist Vietnam that it once was, that we were fighting. Fast forward a few more years, and I get elected to the State House of Representatives and had the opportunity when I was young to go to Vietnam with the American Council of Young Political Leaders. Go back and see where my father's base was. Go back and see where our fine men and women were fighting on behalf of freedom and liberty, not for oil, but for freedom and liberty to stop the spread of communism. When the Soviet Union fell, those of you who were there in Vietnam, you know the rice paddies, they were everywhere. When the Soviet Union fell, they did not have the money to feed their own families because they were being subsidized by the Soviet Union. Vietnam had to import rice to feed their family. They were the second largest importer of rice in the world because they did not have a system in place where they could utilize the resources that they have, the rice paddies that they have, to be able to feed their own people, because the communist system did not teach them how to do that. President Clinton went to Vietnam, the first president since the fall of Vietnam, since the end of the Vietnam War. President Clinton was the first one to go there. He signed the bilateral trade agreement with Vietnam. When he signed that, Vietnam was importing rice, the second largest importer of rice in the country. 5 years later, after Clinton forced the communist government to give private property rights to the Vietnamese people, and the Vietnamese people were able to benefit from the efforts of their labor and work the ground for themselves, they became the second largest exporter of rice in the world in 5 years. If you go there today, South Vietnam is like Hong Kong. Saigon is like Hong Kong. It is a free market money-making machine. Those folks in South Vietnam did not forget how to make a buck between when South Vietnam fell and when the bilateral trade agreement was put in place. They immediately jumped in and started making money. 80% of the revenue for the entire country of Vietnam comes from Saigon. 80%. But you still have that repressive communist government up in Hanoi. But I would say that freedom is still on the march. Liberty is still winning. The free market system is still the greatest system ever devised. And your sacrifice, the sacrifice of all the men and women who sacrificed in Vietnam, was not in vain. We will win that war. We will bring down the oppressive governments of communism across this country, across the world, by being that shining light upon the hill that shows that freedom and liberty shall ring forever, and the free market system still works. I want to bring it full circle. We were fighting communism. We were fighting an oppressive government system. And our system is winning. Our soldiers are winning in the name of freedom and liberty. Thank you for your sacrifice, and God bless you all.